Hello and welcome to episode 70 of Elves, Wings, and Nerdy Things. We have been teasing something exciting, and our teases have come to reality. We are excited to announce that Colin McComb agreed to come in for an interview. So we talked about a whole bunch of fun things, from D&D to the current state of RPGs. So Sam, why don't you give us a little background about Colin before we air our interview?
Right. So Colin McComb is a writer, both for tabletop RPGs. He's a longtime writer for TSR, working on a variety of Dungeons and Dragons products. He's also been a video game writer and designer. He worked on Planescape Torment and Torment Tides of Numenera, in addition to a variety of other products. And he's currently the founder and leader of a video game company, in addition to writing a series of fantasy novels. So he has a wealth of knowledge, and we are looking forward to bringing it to you today.
We were not able to cover everything we wanted to cover because he had too much valuable information to give us. So this is going to be part one. I think this part is going to focus more on his start into fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons and TSR. So, and his companion piece, the Complete Book of Elves, that he wrote for TSR. So part one, that's going to be this. That's what we're going to cover. The interview ended up going a little bit longer than we anticipated. So thank you, Colin, for putting up with us for the amount of time that you did. And I think it'll either come out in 2 or 3 parts. So thank you for sticking with us over the next couple weeks and giving Colin your undivided attention. Welcome to the interview section of our episode today. We're welcoming Colin McComb. So thank you, Colin, for deciding to come on to the podcast. We really appreciate it. We just kind of want to get started with your introduction to fantasy, whether that's books, games. Do you have any favorite stories or properties that you grew up with? So we've talked in the past, Sam and I, and the name of the podcast that we have, it's pretty heavily Tolkien for us, but what was your introduction to fantasy as a genre?
It was Lord of the Rings. Well, I started off with The Hobbit. I think it was actually the Rankin Bass, the cartoon of The Hobbit. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And I read the book. And then I discovered Lord of the Rings right after that. And, there were the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, then animated shows for the movie, which also were just, a huge influence. Like, oh, wow, you could actually bring this stuff to life. And right around that time, my older brother had a friend in Illinois where we moved away from. And we would go back to Illinois every summer. And he came back to my grandfather's house that day and said, yeah, there's this game called Dungeons and Dragons. And there's a dragon sitting on a pile of gold. And we fought it. And it was so cool. I was like, oh, man, I totally want to do this. This sounds like so cool. And so my mom actually went out and bought us the basic set and the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, bunch of minis. And we just dove in. We got crazy with it. Shortly after that, a friend of mine named Tim Callan told me about a book where the hero was named Corwin. Decided he was going to call me Corwin because it was so close to my name. That was 9 Princes in Amber by Roger Zelazny. So that was the second fantasy series I ever read, right after Lord of the Rings, and that had a huge impact on me. I don't think enough people these days know about Roger Zelazny, but holy crap, the dude's a fantastic writer with an imagination that will blow you away. So those two things are probably the linchpin of everything that has come after. Oh, combine that with the movie Heavy Metal, which I saw with my same friend when, that came out. My first R-rated movie. Very cool to see naked women at that tiny age. But also the storytelling in that was, a lot of pastiche, jumping from character viewpoint to character viewpoint. And that feels like, okay, cool. So all of this stuff is interconnected and I can tell stories in that way as well. And so the combination of probably those three things was the linchpin or the launch pad, I guess, for everything else that I've done in my career.
I think we're gonna, Sean. We should put a pin in that series. It was what was it? Who's the author again that you mentioned?
The Chronicles of Amber.
Chronicles of Amber. Is that is it Appendix K in the back of the player's handbook or the Dungeon Master?
You know what? The first edition stuff is upstairs in my son's room, so I can't tell you for sure, but I'm pretty sure it's in there. Yeah.
Okay.
It was a while before I got to some of the other stuff in there, like Jack Vance or Fritz Leiber, but some of that was just very, very worth diving into.
I read the Three Hearts and Three Lions. This was probably like 7-8 years ago, and you could see where they got some of the early inspiration. I think it was maybe the origin of the law and chaos dichotomy in some of the early D&D stuff. It's fun to do that kind of archaeology or anthropology of the dragons, because there's so many different great materials that otherwise you probably wouldn't hear of, because Tolkien takes up so much space.
Yeah, exactly. Michael Moorcock was a big influence as well with the law and chaos stuff, but that came into play more, I think, with the Planescape setting. But that was that whole idea of the big cosmic background war that people don't generally think about until they suddenly stumble into it and find themselves a part of something much greater.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the animated Hobbit, which we've covered on this podcast.
We absolutely love that animated Hobbit. Yeah. It's
such a good one. That was my first introduction to fantasy as well. We had it on VHS, and it was great. And I can't find that VHS. I've moved too many times, but we covered that. And then the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings did not age as well, I don't think. I don't know. Have you seen that recently?
I have not. I just remember the rotoscoping felt weird to me even as a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's as an adult, it's a little weirder.
Yeah.
Return of the King, the most memorable part of that for me was where there's a whip, there's a way. So there's a YouTube clip or a YouTube video of just that song, and it's always popping up on my recommended videos list. And I've watched it a couple times. And there was another thing that you mentioned, which was the heavy metal, which I think I have not seen the entirety of that. I know that's something that my dad had seen, and I didn't realize that we should say that most people in the age bracket that Sean and I are in are probably more familiar with the South Park episode that is an homage to heavy metal, which I guess that's probably maybe something that we could cover, Sean, for the podcast would be heavy metal.
Episode of South Park?
not that episode of South Park, but heavy metal itself, because I think that was pretty well received in its time. It had a pretty wide theatrical release, correct?
Yeah. And, it had basically all the National Lampoon, Saturday Night Live alumni in it too. John Candy was in it, Harold Ramis, I think Bill Murray. There were a lot of big names attached to that. And the soundtrack was just amazing. Yeah.
I mean, that's I think Sammy Hagar comes to mind, obviously, with the actual heavy metal song, but there was a bunch of other guys too, right?
Yeah, like Blue Oyster Cult's Veteran of the Psychic Wars featured prominently on there. And that got me into a whole Blue Oyster Cult thing and discovered that Michael Moorcock actually wrote that album with them. So there's songs about Elric and songs about Law and Chaos, and it's really cool to dig into their lore. And then I wound up seeing them live. Because my wife used to be in a metal band called Jack Off Jill, so
that's awesome.
She knew a lot of people, and so we got to actually be backstage with Blue Oyster Cult, and that was, I tried to be cool and not oh my god, you guys are so inspirational to me.
Start talking about Michael Moorcock backstage. Yeah. I saw Blue Oyster Cult at Kalamazoo Rib Fest. And that was my first live music big show. Was Blue Oyster Cult?
Was that outdoors?
Yeah.
That might have been the show we were at.
No way.
Yeah.
Okay. I love the song Godzilla.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, okay, that doesn't say anything special, but I specifically remember their introduction to Godzilla. They were talking about, is it a Detroit lion? Is it a Chicago bear? No, it's Godzilla. And then they went into the song. So that'd be funny if you were there too. Small world.
Yeah, it was definitely out in that neck of the woods. We had to drive a ways to get there. So
okay. So it's kind of related to some of this. You mentioned Lord of the Rings, Ralph Bakshi, heavy metal. Did you ever see Fire and Ice, the Frank Frazetta, Ralph Bakshi collaboration?
I tried, and I don't think I was at a stage in my life where I could appreciate it.
Okay.
So I have no idea if it's actually worth appreciating.
Got it. Yeah, it's one that I watched. This was a couple of years ago, and it's very straightforward. I think the impressive part was the quality of the rotoscoping and the animation. I think the story itself was relatively generic.
Yeah.
But interesting visuals.
I tried to like the movie Wizards, another Bakshi film. I don't know if you guys saw that.
We did. We covered it for the podcast.
We watched it for the podcast. Yeah,
that had some really interesting ideas and visuals for it as well. It just, again, one of those things where I was like, I really wish I could appreciate this more. I took away enough from it that I think sufficiently appreciative.
I think let me say this. It's hard for a modern moviegoer to really, I think maybe at its time it was a little bit more impressive to say, but nowadays, okay, it is. Yeah, I don't know if it's stayed as relevant as it once was, perhaps.
Yeah, well, with storytelling in general these days, it's made such a huge change, and I think probably the impetus for the change was Terminator 2 or Aliens, where you've got where essentially those are the blueprint for the modern action movie. Right, where you jump in and there's immediately the hook. There's the action right away to just get you locked in. Whereas the old movies would be like, yeah, you know what, we're going to take our time with this story and we're going to ramp it up, as opposed to got to get your interest right away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's even Aliens or Terminator 2, modern audiences have a harder time, I think, getting into these older movies because it's not all just hit you right away and just keep you hooked.
Yeah, that's. Thinking about the original Alien, that movie is incredibly slow. I mean, there's a little bit of action scenes, but you don't even see it. I mean, he just kind of, what's the John Hurt's character is the first one he gets the face hugger. Yeah. You don't really see a ton of action there. It's more of a horror. It really was a Jaws in space was the tagline, right? You didn't see the shark in Jaws for however long into the movie, and that was but I love the Alien and Aliens. Alien 3, maybe that's something where I'm a little bit older. I can come back to it. But yeah, David, I think it was David Fincher's first feature, kind of showed somewhat. But there was.
He definitely had some ideas that did not get fully implemented, I think.
He did. I think the studio had a lot to do with that, too.
I mean, but really, killing off Michael Biehn right away, there's just such a mistake.
Yep. But Michael Biehn, that guy. I mean, you think he is in Aliens, Terminator. He was also in, I think he played a Navy SEAL, like 3 different movies in the 90s, including in Navy SEALs.
Yeah. He was a big James Cameron guy for a while.
That's right. Okay, so we're talking about James Cameron in movies and Aliens, which is a little bit off from where we are. We started with talking about fantasy. So you discussed how you got into fantasy, and then discovering D&D. Take us from that point going forward to kind of becoming an author, becoming a video game designer and writer. What's your trajectory?
Right. So Mike's friend Eddie had a probably outside influence on everything that came in my life after that. He was the one who introduced us to Dungeons and Dragons, and he also introduced us to a computer game called Ultima 2, which was hands down one of my favorite games. We on the Atari 810, not exactly a powerful machine, but it was what we had at the time. So that combined with Dungeons and Dragons, I would make characters, we would play games, we would power level our characters, all the stuff that 13, 14-year-olds get up to with their D&D characters. Just go through the Dungeon Master Guide, like, what, that's a cool magic guide. I'm going to add that to my guy.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I've got a quiver full of 100 javelins of lightning. I just carry this around with me all the time. It's totally reasonable, going through and trying to game out Queen of the Demon Web Pits, sitting down, reading out all these old modules, writing adventures for our friends, starting D&D clubs in school. I think I was 14 or 15 when I sat down and I saw there was a name on the cover of one of these modules. And I was like, wait a second, people write these. This could be my job. Holy crap, this could be my job. And I thought that, yeah, hell, I'll do it. I kept playing D&D until, I was in college and had some friends who I'm actually still friends with today. And we had just regular D&D groups. We'd spend Saturdays hanging out in the dorm room, eating pizza, playing games. And then as our senior year started approaching, people are like, so Colin, what are you going to do with your life? You're a philosophy major. Are you going to get used to saying, hey, you want fries with that? Oh, we're so clever. And I was like, oh boy, well, I guess now's the time to run, to see. And so I wrote up to TSR and I said, hey, I'm graduating from college. I live only like an hour away from you right now. So I'd love to come up for an interview. If you've got any open positions, I will do anything. And they called me up for an interview. Well, first they had me write an adventure using the Complete Vikings Handbook. And so I sent something up and they liked it enough that they called me up for the interview and said, okay, here's another one. Do another writing or another adventure for us in this interview, I guess, to make sure that I was the same guy who wrote the first one. And
about what year is this?
1991.
Okay.
Like March of 1991.
Is this when TSR was based in Lake Geneva?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was basically an hour away from where my college is. So I thought, well, I totally screwed this up. And I said, cool, thanks for the opportunity. It was awesome meeting you. And they said, yeah, cool. Here's some Dark Sun stuff. Just take it back with you for free. Sweet. I'm walking through the halls of TSR it was amazing. It was like showing up to Willy Wonka's factory. Getting to see maps in production, meeting some of the people who worked on these games, like Zeb Cook, Jeff Grubb, Jim Ward, buying huge names from my childhood. Then I thought, well, okay, cool. I guess I'm going to go and get ready for the whole, prep and fries circuit. And a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from the director of human resources, Carol Hubbard, and she said, when can you start? I was like, well, I got to graduate and I've got to find a place to live. So
give me a week.
Yeah, May 15th. So shortly after my 21st birthday, I was starting work at TSR.
And can you, at this point in the 90s, can you just give like an overview of what D&D was like in terms of like the cultural impact? Because I think a lot of people our age, like the millennials, they kind of know it as like the Critical Role, D&D, and pretty much everything from like 2014 on is how we think of D&D. But what was it like in the 90s?
Right. So in 89, I think, second edition Dungeons and Dragons had just come in. And that's what we were playing in college. It was not that long after the Satanic Panic, Mothers Against Dungeons and Dragons bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. They were afraid to use the term demon and devil in source books. So the second edition version was Beatazu and Tanari, the themes in general. It was still very much a niche gaming thing. It was not, something where you're seeing celebrities playing. Now we know that a lot of people my age were playing this, but quietly, behind closed doors where the neighbors couldn't see them. It was big, and people recognized Dungeons and Dragons, and they knew what a role-playing game was, but they didn't. You could say, "Oh yeah, well, I'm going to go play Vampire." They're like, "What's that?" Or "I'm going to play Cult," or Amber Diceless, or anything. If you were talking about a role-playing game in general, people would just like, "Oh, D&D. Yeah, I guess I've heard of that. So you write the adventures?" So I was like, well, yeah, plus also the campaigns and the supplements. And like, well, I didn't have any idea that any of this stuff existed. It was really not a culturally aware thing. Even close family friends didn't really have any idea what I was doing. Just that, well, Colin's always liked games, so I guess he's making games. Computer games were not really big either. So a lot of my interests were pretty niche, and it's kind of weird to see how prevalent all of the stuff that I loved as a kid is now.
Yeah.
And it's awesome, but it's also weird.
Yeah. So one of the things that you worked on while you were at TSR is the Complete Book of Elves, which thank you for recommending this. It was nice to add. I collect the advanced D&D books, so this has been finally added to my bookshelf next to all my other D&D books.
So that was probably, I think, the third or fourth thing I ever wrote.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice.
If you,
So-
if you look up here behind me, you can see my shelf of stuff. So that was that was very early on in my career.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty good flex to be able to point behind you on the bookshelf.
See
and
that
say-
shelf there? I wrote all those. That's pretty impressive.
So the Complete Book of Elves in general, how does that book come about? So in the introduction of the book, it mentions a couple other complete books, like Complete Book of, I think, Dwarves is listed. You mentioned Vikings. But how did you get tied to elves in general?
So there were several different product lines at TSR. If you haven't read Slaying the Dragon, there's a couple of really very good histories of TSR and the end of TSR by specifically Shannon Appelfine and Ben Riggs. 100% recommend reading those for some of the stories there. Really fascinating stuff that even I didn't know from behind the scenes. We were kind of mushrooms in the R&D department, kept in the dark and they shoveled. So anyway, so TSR had a bunch of different product lines. There's the AD&D line, Dragonlance, a lot of different campaign settings. I was a big fan of Forgotten Realms at the time, so it was a little bit of a disappointment to me when my first product was a Dragonlance thing. I absolutely appreciated Dragonlance, but it wasn't the world that I wanted to work in. But I basically just made friends with people in the other lines, and we talked and spread ourselves around. And actually, the guy who was in charge of the D product line, Steve Winter, turns out he was one of the ones who saw potential in me, when I was applying for the job, and he recommended me for this line, for this book. There was the Complete Fighter's Handbook, Complete Thieves Handbook, Complete Magic User, all of the character classes, and then the character races as well. So dwarves had already been written, and they were looking for somebody to write elves for 92 or 93 product line. I guess it must have been 93. They said, "Well, Colin, your schedule is free. How would you like to write this?" And I said, "Hell yes, I love elves." And so, I went and I kicked around some ideas with editor Thomas Reed and Jeff Grubb, who was one of the Forgotten Realms guys in-house, basically the point of contact with Ed Greenwood, and then also Marvel Superheroes designer. And we kicked around a bunch of different ideas about elves and thought, what? If they're really this long-lived, then everybody else has to seem small and insignificant next to them. It's how do you not get an attitude about people who are essentially mayflies?
Yeah, I loved that the section where you talk about relationships between the different races as well. And then the relationship between elves and halflings was a good relationship, but elves were kind of like, yeah, but you're just like this little insignificant people.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
So in terms of like the history and the lore of elves, you just mentioned that you would kind of kick around ideas with other people. Is that how much lore was already established for elves? And then how much did you develop with TSR for the book? Was there a lot of leeway in kind of establishing a set of lore for D&D?
Yeah. So I tried to stay as faithful as possible to the existing material, looking up, using some of the fiction stories from like Christie Golden's Elves of Evermeet, stuff that Ed Greenwood had written for Forgotten Realms, the various kind of elves there, and basically drawing as much as I could from past history to also pull it in to make it more of a cohesive, this is AD&D elf, as opposed to, this is a Dragonlance elf, or this is a Forgotten Realms elf, or a Greyhawk elf. And so I was given some leeway to interpret this and collate it as well, and then passed my stuff off to an editor and the product line manager, and everybody basically approved it. And I guess they probably thought I had play tested some of these rules, and I hadn't. It was basically sort of the rule of cool is what I was going with when I was developing this work. And I should have thought about some of the advantages and disadvantages more carefully. I don't know if you guys saw the apology for Complete Book of Elves on YouTube, but perhaps you should look that up. Yeah, it was one of these stretch goals for Torment Tides: A New Numenera Kickstarter was Colin apologizes for Complete Book of Elves.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up.
I have to say, I did see, I think, a thumbnail. Maybe this was on I saw it on a Reddit page, I think, was discussing it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the, maybe it was a direct quote, but, sorry that you have to have disadvantages in your character. But, and that was something, having disadvantages. So, for instance, something like a -2 on your ability score, which I think I got into D&D in 3rd edition. It was Elves had a -2 Constitution modifier, I think. Sure, the overall score, it was not automatically -2, it was just 2 off of whatever score you rolled. That made the game interesting. And every race, almost every race, had some combination of pluses and minuses. And I think originally half-orcs had +2 strength and +2 con, and maybe a variety of different.
Yeah, definitely -2 charisma.
Yeah, -2 charisma. I think dwarves had -2 charisma as well, which that made the game interesting. It made your character playing interesting. What was the, without rehashing the apology, what else? What were the other kind of criticisms and that you ended up having to apologize for?
So let's see. One of the criticisms is that the elves are essentially, sort of came off to a lot of people as like white supremacists. Very, very much, elf pride. On the other hand, they're living for thousands of years and are good at everything. So I don't know why they wouldn't be proud. And, feeling a little judgmental of the people who can't do all these things. And I guess the older you get, the more wise you get about not needing to be judgmental. But the other one was basically just the mechanical advantages of something like the Blade Singer were offset by role-playing disadvantages as opposed to a one-to-one trade. So the apology was, I apologize for expecting you to role-play in a role-playing game.
Was that a kind of a conflict, a dichotomy that has always existed in the game between the more like hardcore tactical players and the role-playing kind of storytelling players?
Yeah, which I've always been more on the side of the storytelling. That was something that really appealed to me, was diving into this world of imagination and not crapping on the people who are into the mechanical or the tactical or whatever. It's just that doesn't appeal to me. When I got to Interplay after leaving TSR and cover that, there was a group that invited me to sit in on their gaming session. And so I went in, and they were just starting off their 3rd edition game, and they're like, okay, well, my character will take his 5-foot step, and then we'll take his direct action. And I was like, your character will. How about I will? Let's get some. Okay, well, my character talks to the bartender and says, like, no, you say, oh my God, you guys, this is not how to. Okay, play the game how you want, but this is not the way I play. And it sort of put me off, and I realized, okay, you know what, I really need to reevaluate how I think about this game, because clearly a lot of people come to it with a lot of different expectations of what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I've been DMing for, oh gosh, when did we start playing, Sam? 2017? 2016, somewhere in there. So we got really into D&D. I know Sam has played in the past a little bit, but when 5th edition came out, that's when the alarm bells started going off in my head. And that's when I finally got into D&D for 5th edition. And I found it's relatively difficult with the number of people that are coming into D&D right now. When you DM for a group, you have such a wide array of people and how they want to experience the game. So it's funny that you're mentioning this from years ago, that problem still exists today with how people want to play it. So
yeah, there's a lot of options that people have now as well to do more rules intensive or mechanically intensive games. But back then it was, you were either going with the old school rules, graph paper and graphing or mapping out the dungeons, or you're going with war games from Avalon Hill. Mm-hmm. But now it's like, Warhammer, there's just a ton of games that people can play that will scratch the mechanical itch with still sort of a fantasy veneer. So anyway, to dial back to your previous question, so that was Elves. And after that, I went into Ravenloft and then into Planescape and Birthright. And those were each a lot of fun in their own ways. With, I guess I don't know how much you want to dive into each of those, but Planescape was the one that really sort of captured my heart. And that's the reason I wound up leaving Interplay, is because I was offered a job, TSR, because I was offered a job at Interplay, which was making Planescape computer games at the time.
So we should back up for anybody who is not familiar with the kind of evolution of TSR and the eventual transition from D&D transitioning from TSR to Wizards of the Coast. But this was, I don't know when this started, but as TSR was kind of maybe peaking and then heading into the things that resulted in Wizards taking over all these properties, the business model, as you mentioned, was kind of a diversity of different campaign settings and product lines. So you mentioned Ravenloft, Planescape. I think you mentioned Dark Sun earlier. That was all of those were different campaign settings that would have their own source book, specific adventures set in it, supplemental materials. This is all a way of not needing to completely reinvent the edition every time you wanted to launch a new line, but just kind of keep adding different portfolios underneath the overarching edition.
Right. So each of them would get a box set to essentially start the campaign off. So, started with Greyhawk, and then Forgotten Realms did it, and they're like, okay, well, this is the acceptable way to launch a launch. So yeah, you get the box set, and then you get the supplemental materials. So, Perfect Bound or Saddle Stitch, whatever, depending on how big it is. And, again, looking at the shelf here, so like there's the Birthright box set. I helped create that setting. There's Dragon Mountain, which was a massive adventure. Then there's the Planescape stuff here, which is 3 box sets. There's an additional box set here that's not shown. Oh wait, no, there it is. So 5 box sets of Planescape right there, in addition to just a bunch of stuff. And it turns out none of these were profitable. That they were, we all thought they were selling great because we just kept on pumping them out, and we didn't have any feedback from players or the market apart from the occasional, snail mail letter coming in, or in the mid 90s. Like Genie Online or AOL, we could actually start interacting directly with fans, which was both cool and sucky because, none of us knew how to behave online then either. So a lot of growing pains with that. But it turns out that having all of these different product lines for the same game meant that TSR was essentially cannibalizing its own fan base, its own customer base, in order to produce these new lines. So, Ravenloft was suddenly, we didn't think about it this way, but, Ravenloft was in competition with Planescape, was in competition with Forgotten Realms, was in competition with Basic, and so despite the fact that, they each sold, tens of thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of copies, all of this was, it's not like the market was really growing that much at the time. And so sales were just going downhill. And that's what led to the company essentially laying a bunch of people off around Christmas of '96 and the sale of the company in '97. Which, again, I need to recommend the Ben Briggs book. Super, super good, covering the sales and essentially everything going on behind the scenes in Mahogany Row that we didn't get.
And that was the Slaying the Dragon book?
Yeah.
Okay. I've read Art and Arcana, which came out a couple of years ago. I think it had some of those details, but not nearly the amount of detail that would be in just a book that doesn't primarily focus on art. It was a lot of the information through captions and one paragraph here describing an entire, 6-month period of intense action going on behind the scenes with the business.
Yeah. And there's, TSR and the creatives in general were really lucky that Peter Atkinson was such a fan of the game and so grateful for the opportunities that it gave him growing up. And Lisa Stevens and, all of the other people at Wizards who decided that they were going to take a chance on D&D and make it big, especially considering how much the executives at TSR were really trying to put the knife into Wizards throughout the early 90s. After Primal Order came out and then Magic started growing, TSR was like, oh God, we gotta start making our own card games. Okay, well here's Spellfire, here's Dragon Dice, here's Blood Wars card game, all these things, we gotta try and take down Magic. And obviously they didn't happen.
Then Magic takes you over.
Yeah. Which was great for the creatives and the other staff because the management of TSR, none of them were gamers. And so they basically were not understanding the market and not really understanding how to run a company, it felt like.
I always have a little resentment toward Magic the Gathering because I mentioned earlier that I would play D&D at a comic book shop. Mm-hmm. And toward the end of my involvement there, everybody just wanted to play Magic the Gathering instead of playing D&D. I was like, guys, I don't want to invest a bunch of money into cards that I then need to learn how to play. Can't we just, play this adventure that our DM has been cooking up for the past 6 months? And then I got grounded for a while, and my mom wouldn't take me to the comic book store, so things just kind of naturally fell off. So you mentioned Planescape and kind of your primal, your central involvement there. Can you talk about the origin of Planescape and kind of your involvement?
Yeah. So in, I guess, 93, one of the designers at TSR came up with this idea for trying to do something sort of edgy and different with D&D. And he described it to me as, essentially skateboarding through the plains. And he went and presented this idea to executives, and they were like, okay, that's kind of cool. We understand that you want to do something edgy and weird and different and, fantasy on the edge. But we don't think skateboarding is necessarily the way to do it. That's kind of a Poochie from The Simpsons vibe. And so they said, okay, cool idea. We're going to have Zeb Cook, the guy who wrote second edition Dungeons and Dragons and who's been involved with Dungeons and Dragons stuff for basically forever, to write this. And so Zeb got onto that and basically made a pastiche of Victorian era slang with sort of a knowing, wise attitude, I guess, of planar people, understanding more about the truth of the universe and basing it on the alignment charts set out in the back of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, and also based off Jeff Grubb's Manual of the Planes, and turned it into something that you could run with, not just as a Mordenkainen level wizard or, an Elminster level wizard, but somebody who could start off being born in the plains and living there and, essentially being a planar born mortal. And that seemed all so cool to me, the idea of bending reality, of creatures that existed between the blinks of an eye, of something born entirely from belief, of philosophy with a club, that appealed to me a lot because I was a huge fan of Nietzsche when I was getting my philosophy degree in college. And so I was also big into Nine Inch Nails and the industrial scene at the time. So this all very, very much appealed to me. And getting to jump into writing about demons and devils, Beatazu and Tanari, was, just another huge, huge plus in its favor for me. I got to really indulge sort of the darker parts of my imagination on this. And I was really excited when I had the opportunity to be one of the major developers on it. And so that led to me talking to Fergus Urquhart, who was the, division head at Interplay's role-playing division at the time. He came to Gen Con in 1995, 96, and I guess it was 95. And he and I talked, and my manager at the time, David Wise, very strongly suggested I take this opportunity. And I think it's because David saw the writing on the wall and knew that layoffs were going to be coming and the company was in dire financial health. So, I think he absolutely saved my life or my career. So I put in my resignation at the end of August of 96. I packed all my stuff up, drove out to California, and started at Interplay in October of 96.
So before you left TSR, all those box sets of Planescape behind you, how successful was Planescape as a product at TSR, and how long had you worked on it while you were there?
How successful was it?
To the extent that type of information made it back to you guys.
Yeah, we didn't get any of that information, honestly. We knew that some stuff was selling and some stuff was not selling as well, but they did not convey any of that to us. The Ben Riggs books really cover this in a lot of detail, and it was extraordinarily eye-opening. I really wondered why they didn't want to share this information with us so that we could, tailor the work to the fan base a little bit better.
I have to a certain extent, I have to imagine the fact that it became I think the Planescape video game, which we'll talk about in a second, is very well regarded by a lot of people. And my impression has been that there were folks that never played D&D that got into that video game and loved it. So there has to have been some sort of appeal within the Planescape property itself that made it stand out maybe from the rest of the. I mean, you've already talked about kind of its unique take, but you could argue the same thing for Dark Sun and Birthright. They had a unique spin, but there seems to be something about Planescape that had a crossover.
Right. Yeah. So it's I think the thing about Planescape is that it's got a broad appeal to a lot of different cultural elements. It touches on pantheons from across human culture.
Mm-hmm.
It touches on philosophical questions of good and evil and law and chaos and life and death and humanity's place in the universe. A lot of the universal questions that we talk about. And it's not just a standard Tolkien fantasy anymore. It's we're going to take this fantasy and then we're going to say, okay, cool. But what if we take it so that there's more things you can do that don't just involve hitting things and taking their stuff? It's something that demands a lot of imagination from the player that they're not going to find in. And I don't want to sound snobby about this, but that they're generally not going to find in a just standard D&D game. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, now there's elves and there's dwarves, and we've read all this before. We've seen all this before in Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. So if you want to play Lord of the Rings, that's 100% cool. That's absolutely how I got into the game. What Planescape was saying, we can take this core idea and move it someplace, and it becomes something entirely different.
I think playing Lord of the Rings, you used that phrase just now, and I'm thinking back to some of my early attempts at being a dungeon master. Mm-hmm. You're just trying to rehash Tolkien, and you're not Tolkien, and so it sucks and it's boring, and you can't I remember trying to turn the Hobbit into a campaign, and I had one player. It was the guy that got me into D&D. He was a couple of years younger than I was, and he was the one player. I was like, okay, so I'm going to be the 13 other characters in the NPCs. At that point, it's like, that's what you knew. So you tried to play what you knew, and it seems like maybe you mentioned earlier we talked about the focus on storytelling, of make storytelling, make imagination more central to the actual game. And is it fair to say that were there mechanics, game rules that made you get more into the storytelling imagination aspect beyond just kind of what?
No, it was really more I think David Zeb Cook, the author of the setting, I think that one of his big things was making, a game that is a true collaboration between players and the DM. And so he encouraged people to do that. And it was not a rules heavy setting. Mm-hmm. It was okay, we're going to lay out what the setting is like, and here's some stuff, you'll take some modifiers when you go to these planes. There's, things that are going to happen to your character when you go to these planes, but the real draw of it, I guess, is that it's just, okay, use your imagination here to tell a story, and here's the guidelines to do it.
Yeah, I feel like it's relatively similar to running a 5th edition campaign setting, like a pre-written campaign. I'm about to run Princes of the Apocalypse for my group. And when you're reading the book, there's a fine line between railroading them to the campaign so they follow the correct chapters in your book versus allowing the players to then have the free range to do whatever they want within that setting. But yeah, that's still tough today to kind of figure that out.
Absolutely, one of the hardest things about designing RPGs is how do you keep the player on this path that you want them to be on without them feeling like, oh, well, I want to go do something else. Okay, well, this bard has just sung an interesting song about this place across the sea. I'm going to go do that. Like, oh, no. Don't drop any chum in the ocean that you don't want the players to go after.
Yeah, the first time I ran Princes of the Apocalypse, a Cult of Baal made a appearance, which is funny with Baldur's Gate 3, if no spoilers there. But yeah, I had to find ways to keep it interesting for them because I felt like it was starting to get a little too railroaded in. That was part 1 of our interview. Thank you so much for giving us a listen, giving a share. Next week, we will have part 2 of Colin's interview with us. So stick around and hear what we have to say about video games, Kickstarter campaigns, and more.
Current state of Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop gaming.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.